Hi, today's topic is demand analysis and elasticity of demand. Demand refers to the entire relationship between price and quantity. Demand is the quantity that consumers demand at alternative prices during given period of time. Moving on to the concept of demand. The concept of demand includes definition and nature of demand, whereby demand refers to the quantity of the commodity which a consumer is willing to buy at a particular price during a particular period of time. For example, a consumer demands 2 kg of wheat in a month at a price of rupees 20 per kg is a demand statement. Moving on to the factors affecting demand and demand function. There are various factors that affect the demand of a commodity, but these factors are categorized into two types. First type is main factors and the other type is additional factors. Moving on to the first category of main factors, which is price of the good. See, there is a definite inverse relationship between the price of the good and the quantity demanded of that good. Moving on to the next factor, which is price of related goods. Related goods here means substitute goods and complementary goods. Substitute goods are those goods which are alternative to one another in consumption, and complementary goods are those goods which are jointly used or consumed together to satisfy a want. These related goods also affect the demand of a commodity. Moving on to the next factor, which is income of the consumer. This factor means with fall in price of a good, consumer's real income or purchasing power rises and he demands more units of the commodity, specifying normal goods. Tastes and preferences is another factor that affects the demand of the commodity. Moving on to the next factor, which is number of consumers in the market. If maximum number of consumers in the market are present, then the price of the commodity will automatically increase. Moving on to the next factor, which is distribution of income. High income group supposed to grab more demand, and age and sex composition of the population is another factor that also affects the demand of a commodity. Moving on to the next topic, which is law of demand. Keeping other factors constant, the relationship between price and quantity demanded of a good is called the law of demand. It states that if a consumer's demand for a good moves in the same direction as the consumer's income, the consumer's demand for that good must be inversely related to the price of the good. For example, if quantity demanded of a commodity increases, then its price will always decline. Now, moving on to the slope of demand curve. The reasons behind downward slope of the demand curve, or why more of a good is purchased as its price falls, are: first, law of diminishing marginal utility; second, substitution effect; and third one is income effect; and the fourth one is new consumers creating demand. See, law of diminishing marginal utility states that as the consumer has more and more of a good, its marginal utility to him goes on declining. Moving on to the second point, which is income effect. Income effect means with fall in the price of a good, consumer's real income or purchasing power rises and he demands more units of the good. Moving on to the next point, which is substitution effect. Substitution effect means with fall in the price of a good, consumer feels a rise in relative price of other goods, which in turn leads to more demand for the good. Moving on to the last point, which is new consumers creating demand. As price of a commodity falls, new consumer class appears who can now afford the commodity. Thus, the total demand for the commodity increases. With fall in price, quantity demanded rises. Moving on to the next part, which is demand schedule and demand curve. Demand schedule is a tabular representation showing the different quantities of a good that buyers of the good are willing to buy at different prices during a given period of time. And the demand curve is the graphical representation of demand function. Moving on to the next part, which is individual demand and market demand. Individual demand means quantity demanded of a good by an individual consumer at various prices per time period. And market demand is the aggregate of the quantities demanded by all consumers in the market at different prices per time period. Moving on to the another part, which is movement and shift in demand curve. Firstly, we'll talk about movement of demand curve. It is also known as expansion or contraction of demand curve. A movement along the demand curve is caused by a change in the price of the good, other things remaining constant. It is also called change in the quantity demanded of the commodity, whereby extension of demand refers to the rise in demand due to fall in price of the good, and contraction of demand refers to the fall in demand due to rise in the price of the good. Moving on to the shift of demand curve. A shift of the demand curve is caused by changes in factors other than price of the good. Shift of demand curve can be regarded as increase or decrease in demand, whereby increase refers to more demand at a given price or same demand at a higher price, or decrease in demand refers to less demand at the given price or same demand at a lesser price. The factors which are responsible for shift in demand curve are consumers' income, price of the other good, and consumers' taste and preferences. Moving on to the elasticity of demand. Price elasticity of demand is defined as the percentage change in quantity demanded of a commodity to a percentage change in its price. Economist Alfred Marshall was the first one to formulate the concept of price elasticity of demand as the ratio of a relative change in quantity demanded to a relative change in price. The ratio of price and quantity demanded is a negative number because price and quantity demanded are inversely related. Now, moving on to the measurement of price elasticity of demand. Price elasticity of demand can be measured through three methods. First one of which is total outlay or expenditure method, percentage or proportionate method, geometric or point method. Firstly, we'll discuss about the total outlay method. When demand is elastic, that is ED is greater than 1, a fall in price of a commodity results in increase in total expenditure on it. And when elasticity of demand is equals to 1, it is known as unitary elastic. A fall in price of the commodity does not result in any change in total expenditure, and when elasticity is smaller than 1, that means demand is inelastic, which is a fall in the price of commodity results in fall in the total expenditure of that commodity. Now, moving on to the next method, which is percentage or proportionate method. By this method, elasticity of demand is calculated by using the formula in which percentage change in quantity demanded is divided by the percentage change in price. Now, moving on to the next method, which is in geometric method, the elasticity of demand at a single point is calculated as when lower side of a segment of the demand curve is divided by the upper side segment of the demand curve. Moving on to the factors affecting elasticity of demand. The first factor that we've got is availability of close substitute. A commodity having close substitutes will have an elastic demand, and a good with no close substitutes will have an inelastic demand. Now, the second factor is income of the consumer. If the income level of consumers is high, the elasticity of demand is less. The next factor is luxuries versus necessities. The price elasticity of demand is likely to be low for necessities and high for luxuries. Now, moving on to the next factor, which is proportion of total expenditure spent on product. Higher the cost of the good relative to total income of the consumer, more will be the price elasticity of demand. Now, moving on to the next factor, which is number of uses of the commodity. The more the number of uses of a commodity can be put to, the more elastic is the demand. Now, moving on to the next factor and the last one, which is time period. If the time period needed to find substitutes of the commodity is more, the price elasticity of demand is more, and vice versa. Moving on to the next part, which is elasticity along a linear demand curve. The point which touches the x-axis, the elasticity of demand at this point is equals to 0. The point on y-axis, elasticity of demand at this point will equal to the infinity. The midpoint of this linear demand curve represents the unitary elastic demand. In between unitary elastic demand and the infinite demand, there comes the elastic demand, and the point between unitary elastic demand and perfectly inelastic demand, the point that comes is inelastic demand. Now, after studying all the concepts related to demand, its analysis and elasticity of demand, we shall move on to the quiz. First question is, a commodity's demand relates to desire for the commodity, quantity desired of that commodity, need for the commodity, quantity demanded at a specified price within a given period of time. And the answer to this question is quantity demanded at a specified price within a given period of time. Now, moving on to the next question, which is movement along the same demand curve shows option 1, increase and decrease of demand, option 2, expansion of supply, option 3, expansion and contraction of demand, option 4, expansion of demand. And the answer to this question is expansion and contraction of demand. Now, moving on to the next and last question, which is the price of candles increase by 22% and the quantity demanded falls by 25%. This indicates that demand for candles is option 1, unitary elastic, option 2, elastic, option 3, inelastic, and option 4, perfectly inelastic. See, for answering this question, we should follow the proportionate or percentage change method, and according to that method, the answer to this question is elastic demand. Now, we have covered all the topics of demand and elasticity of demand. So, thank you for watching.